slides to go up?
Yes, the slide.
Over there.
Yeah, this is the remote control for the slide.
Yeah, and I can see the slides over there or not.
You can see the slides there or there.
I'm making it stand there.
If you prefer, if it's easier for you, yes.
Yeah.
Or
Okay.
if you prefer that,
So
yes.
otherwise I'll do the slides.
Yes, yes. Well,
But
do
maybe
that for, do that from the podium.
it's just that
Give it,
it's
give it
difficult to. Yeah. Anyway, I prefer to sit actually.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Thanks for joining our session on AI and healthcare, as you can see from the creative title that we put on this slide. We are delighted to be here. We want to thank CPDP for organizing a conference on the topic of artificial intelligence, which is very current. Intel hosted last year a session on AI and privacy, and it was a successful event, and we decided to double down this year on this bet, and we want to focus this year on artificial intelligence and healthcare. Healthcare being a very promising vertical, a very promising sector for artificial intelligence, a wealth of innovation, a lot of AI, machine learning, deep learning based applications in healthcare already news. A lot of applications that can be life-saving, can be life-enhancing for citizens. At the same time, a higher degree of risk as we need to process health data, which by definition are very sensitive data. I invited, and I'm very thankful to our speakers today that accepted our invitation. I would like to explore today how we can use and share data in an innovative way in the healthcare sector, while also ensuring the highest protections for citizens and patients. And I would like to discuss this today with my distinguished panelists. I want to start from Effie Vallena, professor at the Institute of Translational Medicine, Department of Health Science and Technology at the ETH Zurich. On my left, we have also Elettra Ronchi, Senior Policy Analyst and Head of Unit at the OECD, in the unit responsible for data governance, privacy, and risk management. The gentleman close to Effie is Alberto Gago Fernandez, Policy Officer at the European Commission, responsible for data policy and innovation at DG Connect. And last but not least, Joni Komulainen, Ministerial Advisor and leading legal expert on e-health and data protection issues in Finland. So we will have a first round of introductory remarks by our speakers, and afterwards I will open up the general discussion. We have prepared some questions, and then towards the end I want to open the floor to the audience, so please be ready when we will open the mic for the audience. Let me start, Joni, with you. Finland has enacted recently a law that actually allows for the secondary use of data for healthcare purposes. This is a trailblazing initiative, and it can be seen in the context of the GDPR implementation. We are all very curious to hear more from you about this, so I know you prepared a few slides, and please please go to the podium.
Good morning on my behalf. Yesterday I was in Lisbon and we were talking about a European health data space and how to make it happen. And it came to our turn to talk about European health space, data space, and I replied that we have made it happen in Finland already. Not just health data space, but we have social affairs data as well, and benefit data. And we have socioeconomic data linked to that data as well. Because if you want to study, do studies and get wonderful results, you don't just need health data. You need all that data that interlinks to the person's health, socioeconomic situation, and benefit data. So we have made it happen already in Finland. How did this happen? For years, we have gathered data in Finnish health registries. I mean, since the 50s, we have gathered data structured in health registries. The quality of data is very high, and we have unique ID number that interlinks the data to one person. So one ID number, theoretically, you could get all the information regarding Jouni Komulainen, if there's a legal base for it. And sort of the challenge was how to securely, fully utilize the health and social data for these sort of purposes, which are research, statistics, development, innovation activities, education, knowledge management duties, and steering and supervision of social and healthcare by authorities and planning and reporting duty of an authority. So those are the different legal bases. If you look at the big picture, and that's the big picture you see over there, hopefully, below are the data sources that can be accessed through this legislation. All those different data sources, MyKanta, health data, Statistics Finland, Center for Pensions, Population Registries, National Health Institute for Wealth and Welfare Registries, social insurance institutions, local registries, both the public and private sector, social and healthcare data. In the future, we will have genome center data, cancer center data, neurocenter data, biobanks. The challenge has been trying to make this legislation compatible with the biobank and genome legislation and the European legislation regarding clinical medical trials. But the scope of the legislation is all that data which can be accessed from one authority, the permit authority called FinData, and for all those different purposes that I just mentioned that can be seen on top. So, who can access the data? Basically, anybody. One person, operator, needing the information. It doesn't have to be in Finland. As far as the legislation is concerned, at the moment it's not technically possible because we don't have European EID for this, but we could have the European EID. So in the future, once we have made this happen, you could use a European EID and get the data from Finland from one data permit authority, which is called FinData, that grants the license to use the material or accepts data requests and notifies the decision maker needing the information. Then in the future, at this stage, it's FinData that's doing the service operator operations, which is collecting, combining, pseudonymizing, and anonymizing data, and release it to be used in safe and secure environments. So how to make this safe and secure, the idea is that the data will be released in safe and secure audited environments where you have the best available tools, but you can't get the data out. You have to manage the data within safe and secure audited environments. And there could be chain of safe and secure environments around Finland, or possibly in the future in Europe. Electronic portal for applications. So yet again, once we have the ERD, you could send the application, one application, for all those different purposes, from all the different data authorities, register controllers, to FinData. FinData will give you the permission to use the data, mainly in safe and secure environments. What's given freely to use is aggregated data. So we already have this one-stop shop for getting health data, social affairs data, benefit data. And on top of that, I forgot to mention, we have actually managed to make our quality register part of this system as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joni. This is a very comprehensive overview, and again, congratulations to Finland for this trailblazing initiative. I see a lot of interest also in the audience, and my colleague Mario Romao and I have discussed over the past few weeks. It's fascinating what Finland is doing. Elettra, I would like to ask you about initiatives that other countries are taking in this space in order to enable the access to data and use patient data for secondary use, of patient data. So there are some steps taken in Israel, in Norway, in France, and the OECD is looking very closely at that. And you, the OECD, and you published very recently some reports. We would be very curious to hear more about this and have your insights on this topic. Thanks.
Can you hear me? Yes. So thank you, Riccardo, and thank you for inviting me on this panel. And indeed, I would say that it is more than 2 decades that OECD governments are investing significantly in attempting to improve their health information infrastructure to better exploit the wealth of data that they collect, to in turn improve the quality of care, improve the efficiency of healthcare systems. But we also know that a healthcare system had been very, very slow in embracing the digital transformation. They're probably, in many ways, 10 years behind many other sectors of the economy, and this is a result of some of our recent work. So I would say that the conditions that we see have made possible what Joni just described are not met in many OECD countries. And I'll get to that a little later, and certainly the discussion will focus particularly on why, what are the reasons. But let me return briefly to your introductory statements, and particularly to the fact that I think nobody in this audience would deny that artificial intelligence provides enormous opportunities for healthcare systems to improve prevention, diagnostics, personalized medicine. But as you said correctly, at the same time, we cannot exclude the potential of misuse and abuse of personal data. So the number one issue is trust. And when we look at artificial intelligence, whether it's applied to healthcare or other sectors of the economy, the issue of trustworthiness of the artificial intelligence systems that are put in place is equally important. So what I'd like to do in the next few minutes is give you some, highlight some of the work that we've been doing to address the concerns of governments, and particularly how governments are looking for practices that could balance the risks and benefits in enhancing access and sharing of data. So what I'd like to remind this audience is that last year, in May 2019, the OECD countries adopted the very first set of intergovernmental policy guidelines for responsible stewardship of trustworthy artificial intelligence. And the recommendation recognizes that trust is key and lists 5 complementary value-based principles for the responsible stewardship of trustworthy artificial intelligence. and which highlights that AI should, first of all, contribute to sustainable development, inclusive growth, and well-being. And it should be used in ways that respect human-centered values, fairness. It should be explainable, transparent, robust, secure, safe, and accountable. Now, while not legally binding, the OECD recommendations carry political weight. And I think this audience is very familiar with the OECD privacy guidelines, which were first developed in 1970 and influenced the legal developments across the OECD countries. A parallel stream of work, and that has a lot of bearing for this discussion, is work that we've been doing in examining across the economy what are the conditions and what conditions need to be met to improve access and sharing of data. We just released a report, and you see it here, Enhancing Access to and Sharing of Data. This report is available online. You can read it online. And a key conclusion from our work is that despite the growing evidence of the economic and social benefits from data sharing and data access, we see that access and sharing remain way below their potential. And the main challenge continues to be how to balance the benefits of data access and sharing with the risks. And what we're talking about here is not only the risks of violations to privacy of the individuals who provide the data, but we're talking also about a range of other private and public risks. In the sciences and in the health sector and in research, for example, there is a wide range of misaligned incentives. We know that scientists are not ready or willing very often to share their data because they fear to be scooped, or they fear the free riding, or they fear lack of reciprocity. So our work looks at a wide range of practices in the field and also looks at what policies are in place and what countries have put in place to try and address this situation. And what you see here, the single chart here that I put up, is how most of the actions by governments so far has been unfortunately uneven and primarily focused in enhancing access and use of data for public sector information. And unfortunately, it seems like this slide doesn't really show the very first sentence there, but the very first bars. So the majority of the actions have been around making data open and improving the sharing and access of public sector information at the expense of, for example, facilitating data reuse across society or the creation of data analytics and advanced analytics capacity across society. So now let me, this is my last slide, and goes back to your question in relation to what is happening across other OECD countries' healthcare systems. We released another report last year and is based on extensive work that the OECD has been carrying out, I would say since 2006, in monitoring healthcare information infrastructure across OECD countries. And what this report, and here I'd like to highlight the key message from this report, is that the key barriers to secondary data use are not technological. The chart here shows how most OECD countries are on the way to digital transformation. And many of the national plans, and in fact, 21 out of 36 OECD countries report that in their national plans, they have made provisions for secondary use of data from their electronic health records. But what's not in place is what is shown on the left side bar here, is that the data governance frameworks are not in place. So the real barriers, and we will have a chance to discuss this further, are not, it's not technological, it's actually linked to non-technological issues. And what you see on the right side is that Finland clearly leading the pack, and then a few other countries that are trailing just behind, but that are slowly putting in place exactly the type of frameworks that address the trust issues, address the trustworthiness issues, and we will have a chance to further discuss this. But let me leave it to this now.
Thanks a lot, Elettra. You sketched a very interesting scenario, and all this is extremely valuable information. I would like to talk to Alberto now, and my first question would be more linked to the AI strategy of the European Commission, but everybody has seen the leaked document, so I'm skipping that. No, just joking. So we see that there's data available. Governments have made some efforts to open up the data sets. Now it's time also for the European Union to take some steps, also in the context probably of its industrial policy, to improve access to data. And this is crucial for the development, the deployment of artificial intelligence technologies and applications. So we have read that the European Commission is looking at specific initiatives that goes under the name of common data spaces, but we haven't understood much about that, and so this is why my first question to you would be about the European common data spaces. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for having me here, first of all. I'm going to add a bit of drama to the discussion. I think we are at a critical turning point at the moment. It's the moment where AI leaves science fiction behind and becomes our next frontier of innovation. And this is in order to pick up on your AI strategy for us. I think AI is already reshaping our economies. It's changing the way we live, we communicate. Also offers tremendous opportunities for businesses and society, as Electra has said. For example, AI systems in the health sector could process large amounts of data from medical alerts and also from other clinical sources, and they can prevent complications of severely ill patients. These AI systems can also help this doctor monitor this patient remotely and much more effectively than before. But in order to use AI systems in the health sector, in such a sensitive sector like health, we need to ensure that these systems are trustworthy. And how we can do that? Obviously, we can follow the guidelines of the OECD, we can follow the guidelines of the high-level expert group on AI, but also we think it is key that these algorithms are fed with high-quality and unbiased data. This key asset is basic for technological innovation, is the fuel for artificial intelligence in most cases, and is also a key factor for competitiveness at the global stage. This asset keeps growing at exponential rates. We have heard already Thierry Breton, our commissioner, said many times that only in 2018, more than 33 terabytes of data have been produced worldwide, and this number is set to grow to 175 terabytes of data by 2025. This is a massive amount of data that we can exploit. Also, the unique selling proposition of the European Union is trust. Here we can say that we can access data and reuse data always in line with EU values and principles, and in particular with the right to privacy of individuals, thanks to legal regimes like the GDPR. So this is why in my unit, in where we work, we think that Europe has everything to play for, as long as it manages to set the right framework conditions in place on time. The way that we organize data access and reuse today, it will impact and determine the innovation capacity that we will have in the next decades. For this reason, we are working on a European strategy, on a robust European strategy on data that will enable wider access of data and reuse for all. But we'll also keep the businesses and the individuals in control of the data that they generate. This will help us get some let's say, greater data sovereignty. Already in the past mandate, we have worked on making more data available. We published the data package that contained the revision of the directive on open data, which Electra has also mentioned in her presentation. And we have also published non-binding guidance on how to share private sector data in B2B and B2G contexts. At the same time, we have examined what are the specific conditions in order to implement common European data spaces in the different sectors, in health, in manufacturing, in agriculture, and so on. I know that some of you will asked me first, what is a common European data space? So I'm going to try to define it very quickly for you. It's a twofold concept for us, okay? So on the one hand, it has a legal component. We cannot create a common data space if we don't set up the right policy and legal framework in place so that data is accessed and reused ethically, responsibly, and also legally. And on the other hand, we have this concept has a more technological or operational component, because we cannot implement any common European data space if we don't develop the technologies for secure and privacy-enhanced access and reuse of data, if we don't deploy these technologies in real-world settings, and also if we don't fund or develop the physical infrastructures necessary for all this to happen. Specifically for the Health European data space, we have seen that it's crucial in this space to give back control to individuals of the health data that they generate, both in the private sector and in the public sector. And why is that? Is because if a patient wants to, they can share their Fitbit data, for example, with their doctors in order for the doctor to have a more holistic view of their health status. But at the same time, it can help this patient to share their health records for research purposes in order to find new cures for diseases. We have seen that user empowerment for the management of their own health data is supported by 90% of the respondents of a consultation that we ran in 2017. Also, in the same consultation, 80% of the respondents, they shared that they would agree to share their data for health research. So this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to, in the Health European data space, we try to set up the framework that allows data to be shared, not only between member states, so that when you go to Finland, for example, you can access your health records, but also with researchers and with the industry, and always in line with the GDPR. Let me briefly finish with this introductory intervention by saying that it's important that we unlock the potential of data for our economy to grow and for our businesses, European businesses, to develop. But we must not forget that we have a responsibility in order to unlock the potential of data to do good for the people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alberto. And actually, it's very, very interesting and also very promising what the European Commission is doing in this space, and all the efforts in promoting data sharing. Effie, I wanted to ask you more about data sharing because you have dealt with this topic at length in your research activity, but also in your collaboration with different international organizations like the WHO. And so please, can you share your views on this?
Sure, thank you for the invitation. And I chose to be analog today, no slide, and reading from my handwritten notes. I think that was a good fit for the session. But yes, so I'll start with a general observation which stems out of research that my team and I did and published a year and a half ago, looking at guidance documents about health data sharing. I don't know the composition exactly of this audience, but the scientific community, particularly the biomedical researchers, have been wanting to share and easily access data for a very long time. So for the last 20 years, is matching your 2 decades of governance work, for the last 20 years, a variety of organizations, governments, private sector have been producing guidance about how we ought to share health data. And a few years ago, it was less data, it was less analytics, but and of course today we have many more potential, much more potential and more potent tools and more data. But the thinking about sharing data dates back. It's not a new question, it is an older question. The good news is that after many, many guidelines, we reviewed 230. And I'm sure we didn't cover the entire universe, but 230 is a big corpus of guidance about what are the basic principles for the accessing and sharing biomedical and health data. And what we found there was that mainly everybody agrees that 3 things need to be taken into consideration. One is consent. I'm sure it's no surprise. Second is privacy. And third is quality and curation of data. These are the three things that the majority of these guidelines have agreed that we really need to pay attention to. A lot less, so they list a number of principles and a number of procedures that we need to implement, but a lot less attention was given to things like even accountability, even solidarity, or attribution, things that really matter to people, but the guidance hasn't really picked up very heavily on those. So I think there are a couple of take-home messages from this exercise that we did. One is that a lot of the groundwork has been done. We know why we ought to share, and we know which are the basic principles that we need to pay attention to. We also know where we've put all our focus and where we haven't. The thing that this guidance document and a number of governance frameworks that have emerged over the years as well about data sharing and access is that, again, and I'll repeat Aletra's point, this is what we identified as well. We still have competing interests, which makes sense and it's totally legitimate, but we also still have competing incentives. And what we ought to do is to try and see if there is some more alignment across the incentives for people and organizations to become more keen on sharing. I think another issue that I have identified in this research and in other activities is that we have what I want to call a legacy problem, but I'm not using legacy in a technical sense. I'm using it more liberally. I think most of, even the governance frameworks that we have, and certainly the guidance about sharing data, is focusing upstream. Consent, how we're going to get the data, what are the conditions, and a lot less downstream. What is the purpose of use? Why are we using this data, and what are we trying to achieve through this use? Yes, there is vague potential and might be fantastically beneficial, but what is exactly the benefit? And how is this benefit going to be distributed and to whom? These questions are not asked, and they're not part of the conversation very much. Now, the reason I think these questions are very relevant is because they have something to do with trust and trustworthiness that you both mentioned a lot. Trust and trustworthiness are not going to be achieved only because we got consent from somebody. Trust and trustworthiness, they will also be achieved if the benefit that's been accrued is distributed fairly. And I think another way to frame this is these are necessary to obtain what we call, at least in my field, social license. We need that social license in order to have the innovation that everybody is talking about. So I think if I had it my way, I would try to shift a little bit the conversation, and perhaps even the regulatory conversation, into the benefit and its distribution to the people. So that's on the data sharing sort of part. There is, again, the link to AI is critical. You mentioned it in the beginning. Of course, we need the data, so we need to go through this process, essentially, in order to be able to use AI or to develop it and implement it. But I think for AI, I'd like to throw three remarks, and I'm happy to take it up on the later on in the discussion. I have the impression that while the potential is probably there, it is a very hyped phenomenon, especially in healthcare. And I'm always concerned when a system of problems that healthcare has across the board is being reduced to one solution. And I think that, for me, speaks to the hype that's been fueling a lot of certain conversations. So I'd like to separate that and say, what is really the potential and what is the hype? Hype sometimes is good because we get enthusiastic about things, but then we need to get to the real story. And to that, I have two points that for me are very important. One is we're still, I think, struggling, at least in the medical sector, to establish what constitutes evidence of effectiveness. Why does this something work? Does something of AI that has been trained on X data sets, does it really work? And that's something that the people in in the health sector have been doing for a long time. It's not perfect in other areas, but it's something very valuable and very specific to healthcare. So that's the one question that I think is crucial. And the second, and that relates to a number of privacy and other questions, is the safety of these tools. Relates to your bias point. Are they trained in the right data sets? Are they secure? And so looking at those points in the AI, which of course they're all very linked to data, I think they will be crucial for how we're moving on.
Thanks a lot, Effie, and again, thank you very much for sharing so much. So much, not too much, so much, and we agreed with the speakers that we would have kept the introductory remarks, very short. But there's so much wealth of knowledge here that I did not dare to interrupt or cut anyone in their introduction. And I'm very happy that they raised so many interesting topics, and I would like to pick a few of those, and would like then to give the floor to the audience. We talked about non-technical barriers. We talked about the focus on upstream discussions. I would like to stay in this area and pick on the trustworthiness issue, because especially in the privacy space, the user control, the individual participation, for many decades has been ensured by consent. And I would like to ask to the distinguished panelists, in the context of reuse of health data for AI and in general for other purposes, how does it play? What role consent can play? I understand, Joni, that Finland is not using consent as a basis for processing, and so as a legal basis for data processing. And so the question is initially to you, but then I want to hear from the other panelists. How can we use consent? Is it consent meaningful in this context? Should we look at other legal bases, public interest, legitimate interest? How can we actually measure the societal value of the use of data sets to be able to also use other types of legal bases?
Okay, thank you. In Finland, when we were drafting the legislation, which was public from the start, which is something you should take into account if you make your legislation, have it public from the very start, so everybody can see what you're doing and get involved, get the stakeholders involved. That's the only way to get the laws passed, because the stakeholders will talk on your behalf once you get them on board. In Finland, usually the private citizens have trusted, whatever the Finland is doing, what the authorities are doing. Like I mentioned, we have the national ID number that's used for almost anything. So people trust, and as I mentioned, we had those data banks, high-quality data banks we have gathered since the 50s. We have gathered them mainly without consent. So it wasn't a new idea for Finnish citizens. But every single time this law is mentioned in public, and it's usually mentioned in the wrong way. Finland is selling its health data abroad to insurance companies and so on, and they don't see the big picture. We are all benefiting from the data. Okay, some companies are benefiting as well, but we are all benefiting. So when we were talking about we're trying to make this legislation from the start, we talked that actually consent is a weak legal base. So we looked at other legal bases, and when we were talking about data regarding special categories that's mentioned in the Article 9 in the GDPR, you had to derive from the legal basis from there. Of course, we deal with social affairs data as well. We had to have legal basis from the Article 6 as well. So mainly the legal basis that we used were sort of, if I'm going to have a look at the same time. Just a second. We're from the article 9 to E or J or A. Not consent. And it was actually very easy to come to this conclusion when you read a majority of the articles and Article 29 Working Party Guidelines. You come to the conclusions that consent is not probably the best legal base. And especially if you're talking about scientists who want their data intact, to them the question of somebody giving consent and then withdrawing, it's impossible for their researchers. So that sort of things we talked about. Yeah, all the different legal bases are derived from Article 6 and 9, and consent is not used as a legal basis. So of course, we have data banks that are gathered using consent, and in the future we will be using those data banks if the use case is the same as the consent was given to.
Well, I think we're facing a very complex situation here. First of all, there is a generalized sense by individuals of lack of control. And I checked recently the results of the Eurobarometer of last year, which was it was a special Eurobarometer done after 2 years from the GDPR. And we see that about 67% of individuals feel that they are in lack of control. And last year, similarly, the Pew Research Center came up with similar results. Actually, 84% of Americans feel that they are in lack of control of how their data is being collected and used. And let me get back to the issue of how data is collected and what Effie just mentioned, that we're faced with legacy systems that are being challenged by the fact that data today is not only provided by the individual, is data that is observed by a variety of devices and sensors, is data that is derived and inferred. So in that context, it becomes very, very difficult to implement our traditional informed consent. So we're seeing actually a wide range of new models in which we are still, and I think that governments and organizations are still very wary of the fact that individuals feel this lack of control, and so they're putting in place a number and a range of consent models. These consent models probably still the most I think used model, but that does create some ethical challenges, the broad consent model. But then we have models that are time constrained, and so giving the individual a possibility to go back, dynamic models. And Effie can talk to this even more than me because you've done a great deal of research in this issue. So my 2 pennies in this is that I think what's happened in Finland, yet again, is a trailblazing initiative. It has very, I would say, there is a very different context there of great trust of the population in the authorities, and which apparently is not reflected in other situations and in other conditions.
And this is a very important point. Effie, do you think in the healthcare sector, for this specific reuse of data, sticking to consent is just shifting the burden to individuals instead of giving them a real control over the data?
Well, I've written about that. I've written about how this actually could be, if consent is not meaningful, it gives you an illusion of control. And I think that we harm people in multiple times this way. First of all, they're not having a choice. Second, they believe they do. And that's a double harm, in my view. So there are, I think, cases of research that consent is necessary and it is the right thing to do. But there's a variety of, and the majority perhaps in the secondary uses, a wide spectrum of research activities that this mechanism cannot be meaningful. And so we got to be honest with people and with ourselves as to what is exactly that we're trying to achieve. If this is just to, be compliant with some sort of regulation that, makes us all look good, okay? But the question is, what is truly what we are getting at? And what Finland is trying to do, I think, it seems to me that there is a different social contract that Finland has. Like, people trust you with their data because I like to believe that they trust that the benefit is going to come back to them somehow, back to their country, back to themselves, back to their healthcare system. So I think in this sense, the consents can do so much, and we know this for a long time. But then for the rest of it, we need to define the public benefit, we need to define the benefit in a way that is also transparent and understandable to people.
Yeah, I think that, just to add to that, I think that what we need also to consider is that while the collection and use of data may be completely legitimate under privacy law, it may actually generate some ethical and moral issues. And particularly when we're getting into this new AI, let's say, era. And so we're more and more discussing within the OECD, and by the way, we are in the middle of the review of the OECD privacy guidelines, addressing some of the challenges to the implementation of the OECD privacy guidelines in the context of artificial intelligence. And what we're seeing is the need for enhanced accountability, transparency, explainability. So what you say, moving from upstream to the use, to the purpose of use, and creating a greater data stewardship.
Riccardo, maybe just a quick point. I mean, what we see also in studies across the world, when we ask individuals, patients, whoever, about uses of data, the majority of people say they would like their data to be used. But we have another phenomenon, which is called antipathy to commercialization. Most people, while they want to share, they have a problem with their data being shared. At least the studies show that. And this is something, again, we need to address. Why do people feel that way? Is it really that they don't like commercialization? I doubt it. Most of these societies live on these principles. But there's something particular to this, and again, I think it goes back, in my view, to what are they getting back? Not in a unit of financial unit, but what is the benefit that comes back to the healthcare system and then eventually trickles down to individuals?
Joni.
Okay, what we seem to forget in this conversation is that all the other rights that people have according to the GDPR are already the data subjects. And what we have done in Finland, we could have a consent as a legal base, and we can still have a consent as a legal base, but how do you give a consent to, for example, social and healthcare services are provided by municipalities, and there are more than 300 of them. How do you get informed consent, regarding all the different secondary use purposes, so that the data subject understands the concept and how long it's going to be valid anyway? We have other legal bases than consent in GDPR, which are as valid as consent. And because we don't use consent as a legal base, we have lots of different safeguards that sort of complement the fact that we are not using consent in safe and secure environments where the data is controlled, handled. You can't get the data out. When you do the publication based on the data, even the publication is examined that there is no even remote risk that anybody can be identified from the publications. And only data that's given freely is statistics. So we have lots of different safeguards, and all the different rights from the GDPR are still not limited, apart from right to object in making educational material to a certain limit. That's the only right we have limited, and that's happened according to the GDPR. So we have all the different rights still available from the GDPR.
Okay, so it seems that we have a set of elements and principles from from the. I want to borrow FIS comparison and say, no, in this upstream dimension, We have solid basis and a number of elements in the legal and ethical, legal and ethical sense. But Alberto, I want to start from you and try to go more in the downstream dimension and try to measure this societal value. And I would like to understand a little bit more about the European common data spaces, how this initiative could interject also with other initiatives that are carried out at national level, and how, in general, can we improve the current situation in data sharing, business to government, and in some cases also government to business.
Okay, well, just to chip into the conversation on consent, what we found in this common European data spaces exercise that we ran over the summer is that in consumer-facing markets, people believe that consent should be the key issue in order to share their data. And we have seen this, for example, with the PSD2 in the banking sector that has allowed the opening of data to secondary markets through consent of individuals. With the common data spaces, I would like to also say that all the workshops that we organized in the different sectors, they all came out with key issues which were data governance models, interoperability and data quality. One of the big questions was how to ensure or how to organize access to the data. Farmers, for example, would like to share their data, but they cannot access it from the machines manufacturers that when they use these machines. Patients, we have seen that they want to research, they want to share their health data for research purposes, but they don't know how. Also, to make clear on the data spaces, this is not only for companies to share data with other companies. The public sector is also chipping in with their own data, thanks to the Open Data Directive. And now we are working on opening a number of high-value data sets that will be very good for the economy and also for societal purposes. And we will open them uniformly across the European Union, and also its reuse will be for free. This is through an implementing act that is flowing from the Open Data Directive. And also, I would like to mention that, and this is very much linked to the point of how to the purpose and the downstream use of data, is that the public sector can not only be a data provider, it can also be a data reuser. And we have seen until now that, for example, private sector data from social media companies or from telecommunication companies can be very useful in order to provide insights to make the public sector much more efficient and to improve our public services. We have seen that insights from telco data can help build a much more efficient public transportation network. It can help contain the spread of a disease. It can also help prepare more evidence-based policies. One example, in order to put the value on what we are talking, is that UNICEF used Twitter data in order to find out what was where there was most anti-vaccination sentiment in the country, so that the public authorities could create campaigns, targeted campaigns for pro-vaccination. This was an amazing use. So already with the guidance on private sector data sharing in business to government context that we published in 2019, we try to encourage companies to share more data. We believe this is a game changer, not only in all data spaces, but particularly in the health data space. And we set up an expert group in 2018 in order to tell us what to do in order to ensure responsible, scalable, and sustainable business-to-government data sharing. And they will publish soon the report, so more information to come on this.
Thank you.
Yes, what I'd like the way you describe these data spaces. In fact, in our work on enhancing access and sharing of data, we're trying and we've tried to move away from thinking of enhancing access and sharing data as a binary concept. Closed and open data. It is in fact a spectrum from closed to open, which allows the implementation of a number of approaches, and also it shows how many different communities of data spaces are emerging. And what you have there is a good example of how at European level you are trying to incentivize these communities and sector specific. But what I'm trying to say is that there is not a one-size-fits-all. we can see that, for example, you will have, for the most sensitive data, you will have access by mainly the data holder, but you could have restricted access by communities through bilateral agreements, multilateral agreements, and then you have on the most extreme side of open access, you would have complete open access of public data. There are a number of different models of approaches and mechanisms to enhance access and sharing of data. And one that I'd like to mention is the trusted third-party model. And for example, it could be a trusted third party set up by the private sector itself. And there is a good example in health of the Healthcare Cost Institute in the United States, which is a platform where HMOs and healthcare providers deposit claim information and cost information. Or we have the public sector could create, across the OECD, there are examples of government creating the conditions for a trusted third party, which is public, like the Health Data Integration Partnership in Australia, to encourage data sharing across government, because let's not forget, even across government, we have problems with access and sharing of data and including of health data. So this is to say that this concept of common data spaces is emerging both, let's say, at regional level, but it has been emerging across this data spectrum and continuum. It's something to look at very carefully, because there are truly a number of approaches out there that can help across this data spectrum.
Very briefly, I wanted to have another question maybe, but I think we will transition soon to
very quickly only
the questions from the audience.
I think the conditions for this access are critical, even for intergovernmental exchanges of data or access. Think of health data from one sector used by the law enforcement sector. I mean, there are things there that, again, or in spaces, getting the governments having access to private sector data that can lead to certain decisions, given the power that governments and states have over their citizens. So I think, again, the purpose of use remains, for me, the critical point, even in these kinds of more, let's say, safer spaces.
Thank you. I would like to, I have a few questions on data format, data quality, and so on, but I wanted to know if there are questions from the audience, so we can open it up, please. There's a mic there, if you don't mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very illuminating on many different levels. My name is Gary Lefevre. I'm with Ananos Big Privacy. I was introduced to a term for the first time yesterday at Maastricht University that I thought might provide a common nomenclature. It was demonstrable accountability. And what was meant by that were the safeguards and proof and auditable safeguards that could prove that data governance had been exercised in a variety of different situations. And using that as kind of a mindset, demonstrable accountability, was curious as to the opinion of different people on the panel of the usefulness of pseudonymization as newly defined in the GDPR to show demonstrable accountability. So that would be my question. Thank you.
The identification techniques play a role in access and data sharing, so please.
What we did in Finland, we tried to explain the legislation to the members of the parliament, and they didn't understand. And we had to sort of explain it in layman's terms. So I'm trying to explain it in layman's terms here as well. So we studied different technologies regarding anonymization. We found them all flawed. And even if within time, we could get better anonymization techniques, they're still flawed if you have other information, other data that's anonymized somewhere, and you have enough resources. You have like big companies like Google, big nations like China. It doesn't take much to break the anonymization. So our solution was that we don't give, initial idea was that we would give anonymized data freely because as far as GDPR is concerned, when it's done properly, using reasonable resources, it's not personal data anymore. But our conclusion is that anonymization indexes are flawed, and so far you get to use anonymized data or pseudonymized data or identifiable data only in safe and secure environments, which are audited environments where you can't get the data out. You'll get the results from there. You can use AI if you want to, but you get the results, and somebody, actually the FinData, the permit authority, actually that checks the results as well, that there's no identifiable data. So that sort of double system of safe and secure environments, and then checking that in the publications there's no identifiable data, that nobody can be even remotely identified. That was our solution as safeguards, because otherwise this law would not have been passed in the Finnish parliament.
Well, the only thing I can add to that is that if we look at the OECD privacy guidelines, we're talking about privacy management programs, and we're definitely, there is a whole provision looking at demonstrable accountability by the data controller. So what you need to have in place are systems and programs that are risk-based approach, and I think that that's what Finland has done, and that is what you want to demonstrate, that you've done your due diligence when it comes to potential risk of re-identification, particularly if you're dealing with sensitive data.
And I want to add just a small note on privacy-preserving machine learning, which seems to be a very promising area of research, homomorphic encryption, differential privacy, federated learning. There are many applications, especially in the healthcare sector, that Intel and other companies are really looking with great interest.
Okay.
Please, next question.
Thank you. My name is Mark van Lieshout, working at the Radboud University in the Netherlands. I like the panel. I really like the fact that you try to broaden up the scope, because I think it's really about data governance as a full package. And of course, there's quite a lot of attention for the consent part, but I would say consent somehow, just to comment, there are two main problems. There's a big difference between consent for medical treatment and consent for the GDPR, and that is quite often mixed, so that's quite relevant to keep them apart, but absolutely that's part of the way the data governance issues are approached in this panel. The other thing is, if you look at the, I fully agree with our Finnish colleague, I'm sorry I don't have your name immediately apparent, that it's a much broader set of rights that data subjects are entitled to. And within this data governance approach, it's very much more the data set, the data rights that they are entitled to which you should take into account, like access to data, right to rectification, and even a right to withdraw. And I would say that, especially the last one is quite interesting, the right to opt out. I was wondering whether you have arranged that as well within your approach. Then I would also fully agree with the fact that consent should not be the legal basis, but there should be not be the legitimate ground, but especially the legal basis. And now you have the secondary use of data, which you say that is a kind of a form that should be taken over by other European countries as well. If I look at the Netherlands, that really would be a problem, I think.
I guess I should answer. Yes, we haven't limited any rights. I mentioned that regarding teaching, when we're making teaching material using the material you get from social and healthcare data, we have limited a bit the right to object, but you have still all the different rights from the GDPR coming. And to the conversation about consents again, if I may add, when we talk about genome data, you can't really give consent because if you're talking about genome data, it tells things about yourself and your relatives. And in Finland, they advertise this, My Heritage service, and some of my colleagues have used this service, and they have gotten results that, they have relatives that they didn't know of. And that sort of results you can get, sort of, if you give consent to genome data, you give consent to data that belongs not just for you, but to other people as well, and that's alarming.
if you can go to the mic, please.
I don't know if you can hear me. Okay, sure. Thanks a lot for the very nice discussion. My name is Mahsa Shabani. I'm from the Ghent University in Belgium. I had a question regarding the concept of benefits for data sharing. And as you may aware that now there is also some kind of push towards the direction that you make individuals to keep really full control of their data. And there are some initiatives that they are letting individuals to actually share their data, but also receive some kind of monetary incentives in return, some tokens or, I don't know, free sequencing in the context of genomic data. And this is really introducing a new concept to the benefit from data sharing, which is completely for the individuals themselves. I was wondering, how do you feel about that? And do you think that is something that is the future, or if it's really going against the concept of public interest or public benefits for data sharing? Thanks.
I guess I'll start again, because we have managed to enable using benefit data. Of course, we have had a conversation whether that benefit data could be used for other purposes, and if you're sharing your benefit data, if that's the solution, that you could gain from something from that, or if the authority that's giving you benefits could give you some benefits because you're sharing data. Yes, we have talked about that, but this legislation doesn't allow profiling, individual profiling. So in order to make that happen, we will have to do a lot of legislative thinking before we can make it happen. But yes, we have talked about it. Whether it will be possible to do that sort of legislation, I don't know, but it's certainly something that we'll study in the future.
Thank you, Marta, for the question, because I think it's actually very pertinent. It is a reframing of a benefit. I personally find it quite problematic for a number of reasons that will take me too long to explain. One of those, though, or a couple of those. First, I think the real value is not in the individual data set. It is in the aggregate. It is in the many. So that's where we should be putting the emphasis. The second is that I cannot imagine how, if you're basically selling a part of, it creates a culture where you're selling a part of what constitutes your identity. And I find this road to be very problematic in the long run. And I can see the number of interests of, getting people who might be lured to get a little bit of money in order to start divulging the large amounts of their data. So I find this conceptualization of individual benefit actually problematic and undermining what we're trying to get at, which is the bigger data sets from which we can get benefit to the public, which we can define the public interest. I think this individualization of benefit takes us away from the public benefit conversation very quickly. It's a complex issue. I cannot, give you a good answer in like two minutes, but it's certainly, I find it highly problematic.
But perhaps what you could comment to, Afi, is how there is a counter movement there to data donation and data cooperatives, where we're not, which actually is quite important here, right?
That's true. There's been that, but there is also a move towards, again, collecting together and sharing the benefit in the community we create. That's, again, the cooperative model. There is a trend. Again, what we're seeing is that these cooperative models have not necessarily taken off. And so it worries me a little bit, because if initiatives like this get in, where they're pushed with, they have different drivers, they might take over. Yeah. And that is a little bit of, I guess, the worry I would have.
Thank you. I saw a couple of hands, but if you could walk to the micro for the benefit of the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent panel session. Thank you. My name's Chris Holder. I'm a technology lawyer from London. What I'd like to ask is, given the growing number of uses of AI tools within the health sector, how does the panel feel? Is there enough attention being given to the regulation of these AI tools as medical devices, or is that something that's completely forgotten?
I can say something about this. I think that there's less attention compared to how the big potential. So there's less into the specifics, but there is a conversation, certainly in the regulatory agencies, about how we're going to approve those technologies for use. The and it's a difficult thing to do. So the FDA is certainly working and has issued also a guidance document on that. The EMA, I'm not sure if it's doing so much, but the FDA for sure. And then there are certain groups in the scientific community that are trying to create a concept of what would it mean what would clinical validation would be for AI tools that we're going to use in the clinic. So there is a conversation, but I would say compared to the rest of the conversation about AI, it's probably the smaller one.
Please.
Only a general comment, we're always behind as lawyers, It always takes many, many years before we get legal tools to different technical tools that are available, and now it's just the AI, and next year something else. So, yes, we are talking about this sort of legal solutions, but like I said, we're always behind. It always takes at least 2 to 3 years to draft legislation and get it passed in the member states' parliaments. So we are doing our best.
So since we have only 3 minutes, we have been told, the last round of questions should be on the one single thing from a policy perspective you would recommend to focus on in the short term. The most important thing should be done, should be addressed. Effie has an answer. So we start from you.
I talked about the same thing for the whole session, so it's easy for me. I think focus on the downstream and purpose of use. For me, it will change the conversation, I think, and it's important. So I would put that on top of my list.
Also, Letra has an answer.
For us, the discussion on accountability is not over, and so we're actually considering putting in some guidance for, in particular, ethical accountability.
So for me, it will be also the purpose and to unlock the data for public good. But more importantly, I think now Europe has an opportunity in order to get IoT data to be reused and to have the second wave of innovation based on that. And I think in the short term, we can gain a lot and stop lagging behind from other countries like the US and China in the reuse of data.
I have a similar answer to this as well. It certainly takes a long, long time, If we're talking about, Finnish legislation, okay, the legislation work started in 2015, but before that, we have done work for decades. So that would be my advice. Do the basic work that you need to do to make the data sort of interoperable and get all the stakeholders involved in order to make this sort of things happen. And get those stakeholders involved when the legislation has been passed to make it really happen. Because once you have the legislation, then you need to know how it's going to actually work in practice.
Can I add a second pitch here? I think we need to look into the trend of data localization, and that's the other point that we didn't touch on this panel, but probably we need to look into very carefully, and we are starting to look into that.
Okay, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking these phenomenal speakers and panelists. Thank you very much. Thank you, and thank you for your attention.